the acceleration of what has taken place since COVID, right? We were already on a bad track. We were overspending, and then COVID happened, and it was just like we just
threw it out.
Just threw it out. And the way politicians talk about budgets and spending money as if it's just this money that
it's Google.
Well,
it's monopoly.
All thoughts and opinions shared in this recording belong to the participants. This podcast is meant to inform and educate and should not be seen as solicitation or endorsement for business.
Welcome to the Market Moment. My name is Matt Walters, and I'm here with John Martfeld.
Morning.
And Lee Mackey.
Good morning.
Today we're going to talk about a little event coming up. Maybe you've heard, but the election next week. So we're going to talk about policy and how it impacts the market, if it impacts the market, in what way. I came prepared with absolutely no data today, so it's going to be a lot of opinion from Matt. But I know John's got some interesting stuff. Lee, he's always dripping with knowledge. So
that's it.
We are going to talk about that. So the election next Tuesday, big deal, obviously, as it always is. But this one's pretty heated. There were a lot of very strong opinions on both sides, and so. We're going to talk about how could that impact the markets moving forward, and what policies does the market actually care about? Because it doesn't care about all of them. I'll tell you that right now. But there are some that can impact markets moving forward. So, John, why don't you start with? You've got some data, just some interesting.
I'll just give some interesting
piece from First Trust.
Little feedback here. So, number one, we know that the market moves on corporate profits, right? Period. So policy has to affect corporate profits.
Right.
So what's one way you can affect corporate profits is taxes.
Right.
Okay, so if the GOP sweep, this is what we can kind of expect. Now, this is from First Trust, company we follow and love and so on, but this is their kind of broadcast or forecast here. If the GOP sweep, which they say there's a 40% chance, this was 2 months ago. It's probably a little higher today, I would guess. Fully extend the 2017 tax cuts, which is good for everybody. Higher tariffs, good for U.S., not for everybody. Curtail green energy subsidies, and reform Medicaid. All right, that's kind of the things that could happen that are
if Republicans control.
Yeah, Republicans control everything. All right, the odds of a split or a GOP president and a Senate with a Democratic House, we would see a partial extension of the 2017 tax cuts and little to no deficit reduction. Okay, and that's important. All right, if the Democratic sweep, then you'll see income, capital gains, dividends, and estate taxes going higher. You'd see corporate tax going higher. You'd see carbon tax or gas tax hike. Now, I'm no genius by any means, but that would definitely not be good for the markets. And I can see if it was a Democratic sweep with those things on the table, that could affect the markets quite substantially, knowing that is on the table. That may not happen, but that would be on the table, right? And uncertainty of that would maybe cause the markets to get spooked, because that would definitely affect corporate profits. Again, it goes back to corporate profits. If we, not to get in the weeds about other things, but what we do with abortion, what we do with some of the social issues do not affect corporate profits.
Right.
But taxes definitely affect corporate profits. So I thought that was interesting. Now, the other thing I'll say, like talking about policies, what policies matter and so on. Some of the things that happen with the president in office may not affect the economy till years and years later. And you may not even attribute it back to that president if you don't know the facts. But as an example, the 2008 financial crisis was a direct result of the Everybody Deserves a Home Act passed in 1996, which took away the bank's ability to have stiff rules on who gets a loan or not, right? And it created the subprime mortgage lending industries.
And it took a decade before we started to see some of the major issues with that.
Yes, it took over 10 years before we started seeing, before that actually collapsed the market. Right. And a lot of people at that time would have maybe blamed the current president at the time, which was George Bush, when in reality it was a policy made, and not that it wasn't a bad policy, right? Everybody would love everybody to have a home. It's just that the greed and the way it was set up was incorrectly done back in 96, and it didn't come into effect until 2007. So some policies that happen and some things that they do, yes, it might affect the markets, but it may be years later before you feel that effect, and you may have forgotten, as the general public may have forgotten who actually or how that actually happened. But this election, I think the key is just the tax difference between the two candidates.
Yeah.
The tax policy.
I mean, the way I would summarize it, if you are a business owner, right, you have investments in the private sector, whether you own a business or you invest in real estate or whatever it may be, or you invest in the public markets, you can look around the world today and at history and see that business, whether they're private or publicly traded, like it much more when government just kind of gets out of the way.
Yeah.
Right? There are certain regulations that are needed and necessary to protect consumers, and all of that's true. But when regulation goes too far, when taxes go too far, when big government gets too big, you can look around, growth slows down.
Yeah.
Growth is harder to come by, right? And you can look at a lot of markets around the world and look at, hey, they have public markets, they have stock markets, they have a decent economy, but like very low growth. And a lot of them are socialist countries, right? A lot of them are communist countries. And then you see examples of markets that start to be more business friendly. A perfect recent example is India, right? And they start to open up the markets a little bit, and they're this incredible growth story where the markets start to take off, and there's a lot of new investment. And so I think just like at a high level, when you're looking at policy, it's like, is policy getting more in the way of just trying to conduct business and trying to run and operate a business, whether that's from a tax standpoint, a regulatory standpoint? If so, that's not a good thing for the markets.
No, it isn't.
Right? And that and you can kind of keep it that simple, right? If in my opinion. But anyways, Lee.
I mean, I agree with a lot of what John was saying. You know, the elections have just become so polarizing. I mean, it's, you know, there's no middle ground. We all know that once the election's over, once January passes and the inauguration happens, presidents come to the middle, typically, because that's the only place that things can get done. So, you know, some of the, I don't want to say crazy, but some of the policies that Trump is throwing out there that kind of seem out there, they have little to any chance of passing. Same thing with Harris. I mean, to your point, Matt, businesses, especially small businesses, need less government interference. They need lower taxes in order to do what they're going to do. They need rates to come down. But, you know, we're not sitting here saying that if the Republicans sweep, the market's going to go up.
No.
Nor are we saying that if the Democrats sweep, the markets are destined to collapse.
Right.
Because eventually corporations, you know, figure things out. They figure the new policies and they'll make adjustments and, you know, business as usual. And so, you know, there's just a lot of unknowns right now. I mean, we don't know. We kind of have an idea with Trump from the standpoint of he's been there before.
Yeah.
And he was very pro-business.
Right.
And you've got to believe that some of those same policies will be reintroduced. I'm not convinced that, you know, we see an extension of those tax cuts. It would be nice. You know, one of the things that I'm advising clients is don't count on them.
Yeah.
If they happen, great. If not, then we need to kind of prepare and take some action over the next year and a half. So it'll be interesting what kind of comes down the pike.
You know, I'd say, like, governments around the world have learned some valuable lessons. You know, one of the things that we're talking about taxes, but also the regulation, like the clean energy regulation that is, in my opinion, so hard on companies. I'm going to give you something that I thought was really, really interesting that came out on Monday in a report we get from Brian Westbury, First Trust, his team. But I thought this was kind of cool. Just I'll give you a couple little sentences from here. To paraphrase Milton Friedman, there are 4 ways in which you can spend money. You can spend your own money on yourself. You can spend your own money on somebody else. You can spend somebody else's money on yourself. Finally, you can spend somebody else's money on somebody else. Okay, now he had a distinction of what each of those meant, but let me get it to where it matters. All right. Google and Amazon inked what are likely multi-billion-dollar deals with power companies to build small-scale modular nuclear reactors. At the same time, Microsoft has agreed to pay for the revival of the shuttered 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania. Why? Because they want to power their own insatiable needs for electricity that will come from data centers to support generative artificial intelligence. Yeah. Solar and wind won't get the job done because they aren't intermittent power sources. To efficiently run AI data center, they need nonstop, reliable, 24/7 electricity. For green energy today, that's nuclear. But not very long ago, they were shunning nuclear.
Yeah, nuclear. Yeah.
If you go across the world, like Germany completely shut all of their nuclear energy down, and now they're in a bad problem, and they're trying to revive them, right? So, like, sometimes we have these government policies, regulation that say, hey, green energy means we have to do this, and then reality sets in, and it doesn't work, and now we're bringing back the dreaded nuclear energy. And I thought that was interesting. If you go on Google and you type in types of clean energy, they don't mention nuclear energy. Yeah. Yet they are themselves buying and doing these nuclear energy things to support themselves, right? But it's not out there as a clean energy source, but they're using it because it's what they need. Well, so that goes back to spending money on themselves, right?
Right.
It's different when you spend money on somebody else's money on somebody else. You don't care.
Well, with like government, like with energy in particular, like it's one thing to say, hey, we're going to incentivize innovation and people to go out and make investments to try to find new energy sources, right? Clean energy sources. But it's another thing to do that and then go like more heavily regulate and ban more traditional, ways of producing energy, right? And so it's like if you would just if and this is both Democrats and Republicans to some degree and different, depending on what you're talking about.
Sure.
But if you would just focus on like, hey, incentivize people to go make investments, to develop new processes and technologies, but don't make it harder to do what we've always done. The energy is the perfect example. I mean, it's just like they should not get in the game of trying to make it more difficult for anybody, so. I saw Greta, forget her last name, but the girl that became famous for talking about clean energy. And I noticed that she was one of her things, she was in a cold environment, she's wearing a coat. And I thought, you know what, that coat has petroleum. That needed petroleum to make that coat she was wearing. Yeah. And I think, does she even know that? Right? Like the point is there is a need for all of this quote unquote dirty energy stuff that we have. And until we find a replacement, the need is not going away. And the demand is not going away. All we're doing is shrinking supply, which then in turn creates poverty and problems because costs go up for everybody and nobody can afford anything. Right. I mean, this is like easy to figure out, but to your point, you can do both. You can find ways to make things better always. Sure. And while you're doing that, you can keep everything in order and try to make it as clean as possible. You can do both. You don't have to shut off one thing. And I think that's what they got in that kick of we're going to stand up and do what's right, and in reality it hurt. So for example, Germany went through a pretty tough time, and now they're realizing and they're having to rewind all that. So does that suddenly make them a non-climate friendly nation? No. It just means they did exactly what you said. They shut off something they shouldn't have. They should have kept searching, but you got to keep the source.
I'll mention here, we've talked about taxes and various other regulations. One thing that I don't talk about a lot, that you don't hear a lot talked about, is both parties, they're spending crazily.
That's the number one issue.
And I'm telling you,
I agree totally.
The older I get, it really is becoming an issue now where it's going to be my children and my grandchildren who are going to face it because, it used to be not too long ago that the Republicans were the party of fiscal responsibility and budget balancing, and the Democrats were spend crazy. It's not that way anymore. I mean, the deficits actually went down in the Obama administration ever so slightly, and they went down during the Clinton administration. And in the Clinton administration is when we last had a balanced budget. Deficits are spending so far out of control that the time we should have been kind of making hay on it is over the last several years when we've had a booming economy, the stock market is surging, low taxes, low rates, but instead it went the other way around. What happens when we have a drastically slowing economy? I'm concerned about it.
I think you should be. I am too. And I think the only thing I would disagree with you on is I don't think it's a your kids and grandkids issue. I think it's the next 5 or 10 years issue.
And it could be.
Because the acceleration of what has taken place since COVID, right? We were already on a bad track. We were overspending, and then COVID happened, and it was just like we just
threw it out.
Just threw it out. And the way politicians talk about budgets and spending money as if it's just this money that
it's Google.
Well,
it's monopoly.
If you're spending your own money, whether on yourself or someone else, it means something. You'll care about it, right? But if you're spending somebody else's money, especially on somebody else, you will not care how much you spend or what you get for it.
Right.
And that's what happened in our country. But I go back to the spending. One term that I am about sick of, and it makes me ill every time I hear it, is everybody's got to pay their own share. Yeah. We got to make sure everybody pays their own share. I am so sick and tired of that. You go back and look at the history of our tax situation in the United States. So the booming United States back in the early 1900s, there was no tax. Yeah. We didn't pay a tax, but yet we were booming. We were a free enterprise, free country, and we were going out west, and we were doing all these things and expanding without a federal tax. Now, granted, everybody's going to go back and say, well, you need to fund a military, and you need to fund the road system, and you need to fund. I get all that, but even back then we had a military. It's not like we didn't have a military. Somehow they were able to pay them from something. So my point, the tax situation is the biggest bugaboo thing I have. I think if all of us knew what our Republicans and Democrats were spending the money on in Washington, D.C., and what every dollar was going, it would make us all revolt on Washington, D.C.
The lack of transparency is ridiculous.
So
it's terrible.
The national deficit for fiscal year 24, which it's not a calendar year, but
right,
1.83 trillion. Okay, same time last year was 138 billion less.
Yeah,
I mean, these are numbers that we
and
can't put our hands.
When you get used to just trillion, being a normal thing.
Next thing it'll be 10 trillion, then 100 trillion.
Well, nobody wants to be the one to make the hard decisions. I mean, you almost need politicians.
You need
who
term
are
limits.
you need politicians who are all term limited.
Yeah,
they don't care about reelection. Yeah. That just are going to get in there and say,
and to your point, it's not an income problem. It's not right. They say everybody needs to pay their fair share, and it's such a twisted. I don't know if you watched.
Terrible.
I watched Kamala Harris's town hall on CNN just a couple nights ago.
I watched excerpts from it,
and there was a lady that got up, and she's like, she was a widow and had kids, and she's like, all I ultimately care about is taking care of my family, and this notion that the rich need to pay their fair share, and she threw out some data points of the wealthiest people in the world pay X percent of the federal income.
Yeah.
And she kind of called her out, and obviously Kamala didn't actually answer the question. But
I grew up in a neighborhood with my mom and my aunt.
Anybody who knows anything about the actual data and the facts, knows that that's just a talking point.
Yeah, right? it's a talking point to get. This is the whole point, and this is just infuriates me as well. They try to create monsters on the other side, both parties, right? They try to create this thing that the other side's out to get you. And the thing that the Democrats try to make sure everybody thinks is that the Republicans are all the rich people that just don't care about anybody but themselves. And I heard somebody talking about how Elon Musk is he's going to be sure he's with Trump because Trump's going to make him not pay taxes and all this stuff. And I'm like, are you how can you use it as a talking point? This guy, Elon Musk, has done more for people in need, from the Ukraine army when they were fighting Russia to all the satellites in the world that are going up. They're giving people coverage in Africa and South America, places they've never had coverage, and he's giving it to them for free. And you're going to tell me this guy's worried about a few tax dollars that Trump's going to save him? It's so twisted and stupid. Well, we attack people for political reasons, and it's not right. So it's not correct.
Rambling. This is a slippery slope because we're starting.
Yeah. John, if you could take a couple moments and tell us how you feel.
Yeah. But one thing, going back to the everybody needs to pay their fair share. It's a talking point, and if you legitimately said, okay, the wealthiest of the wealthy, these multi-billionaires, aren't paying a whole lot in taxes because of the way they can capitalize on investment and business losses, and there's some truth to that.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And so that you're talking about the very, 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 very top of the top. So let's not act like that very small issue is something that we need to change the entire tax code. If you want to change that, change some loopholes of how people can claim business losses, capital losses, and don't allow them to use that to offset as much income. If you're, there are things that, and I'm not saying I'm for that. I'm not promoting that. But this idea that you're going to use a handful of people up at the top that have these losses that they're able to carry forward and offset against income and don't pay a whole lot in income tax and then make it out to say like, hey, everybody who makes over $1 million a year is not paying. It's just so far from the truth. And the last thing we need to do is going into it, adjusting the progressive tax rates to try to fix the issue.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
It all trickles down to what a lot of people don't understand about economy and so on. What makes America great is that for years, taxes weren't the driving force of what made America great, the income from taxes and government spending. Less government is better. And that's what we separate ourselves from the rest of the world. That's what made us great for 200 years.
So this is and we'll kind of wrap up on this note, the whole Trump tariff idea, right? And let's full disclosure, you both know me well enough to know I'm way too dumb to understand how that would actually impact things. But the part that I do like about just him talking about that is your point that you just kind of made. Like, the whole idea of an income tax we've gotten so comfortable with, right? Our nation was founded on, right? You had the Boston Tea Party, right? It's like, you're going to tax a tea, the heck with it, right? And so we've gone from that to, well, whatever they tell us we owe them, we'll just send it to them, like straight off of payroll. Like we have no, and so the idea of like, no, let's get creative. How can we start working our way back the other direction where we can generate revenue for the government to fund the government, and it's not just all taking money directly from people's paychecks, right? And so, again, I'm not saying the whole tariff idea may or may not be a great idea, but thinking outside the box and saying, like, we need to start working the other direction, I think is a huge positive.
Well, and I think politicians, Lee had said it earlier, term limits would solve a lot of this because term limits, they're no longer worried about getting reelected, and you make tough decisions when you're not worried about getting reelected, right? You can make tough decisions.
We need to have a national vote.
Oh my gosh,
just
be a landslide.
Popular vote. Should there be because you've got people up there whose job is dependent on passing legislation, and like they're going to sit there and say like, well, I'm firing myself in 4 years.
No, they're not going to. Quick side note: 2008, the U.S. it slipped out that Congress voted for themselves a pay raise, right, in 2008, and it got out to the public because all that stuff is public, and there was such an outrage because the U.S. was going through a horrible time, and Congress voted themselves a pay raise. So you know what Congress did to eliminate that? They passed a vote to have an automatic pay raise where they wouldn't have to do it every year, which they had done for the previous 200 years. They made it where it was an automatic pay raise. They didn't have to vote for it anymore, so that they didn't have to face the scrutiny. And it goes back to the Obamacare, the health insurance that was put on the United States, and they didn't take it themselves. This stuff is. Both parties are guilty of it. It's not a one-party system here. It is both parties that are just so afraid to lose that power that they don't do always the right things for us, the people.
Right.
And that's the problem. And the tax side of it, which does affect the economy. The other side, if you raise taxes, corporations, their number one goal is corporate profits, right? A CEO of a corporation. So if that CEO can move stuff, offices and production and so on overseas, out of the country to get that done without having to pay the high corporate tax rates here in the United States, whatever, they're going to do that. Right now, the corporate profit might still be good, so that company might still look good on the stock market, and the market might not suffer, but our overall economy suffers because people lose jobs. And then what I think, last point, the more jobs you have, if you had a flat tax rate of 10% across the board, across the country, and everybody was working and paying that, it is far better than having a top rate of 65% and driving those people out of the country, right? And those are the people that employ the other people. Like it's common sense to me, but it's also about getting those term limits would solve a lot of this.
This time next week, the ads will be over. Yeah, but I saw this morning, 42 million people have voted.
Wow.
Already.
That's
it wasn't too many elections ago,
right,
where the entire vote was about 42 million.
No doubt.
42 million people have voted early, and we still have a week to go. So
Well, we started this podcast with the intent to talk about how policy impacts the market. Thank you for letting us vent about our political opinions.
Nobody
right?
knows what side I'm on,
Yeah.
surely.
So get out and vote.
Yeah. Vote.
Exercise your constitutional right.
Exactly.
Absolutely. It does. So I think to summarize, it really was. This was like a therapy session, I think, for the three of us. But to summarize, it matters. Policy matters, but don't let the outcome of the election make you make knee-jerk reactions
Exactly.
from an investment perspective.
Exactly.
And that's kind of the point that we want to get across, that policy matters. It's important, right? It will impact the market. Sometimes it takes a decade for us to even see how that might impact things, right?
Yeah.
And so you don't want to make knee-jerk short-term reactions or investment decisions based off the outcomes of one election.
100% agree.
And just remember, as messed up as our country is right now, God is still in control.
God is in control 100%, and our country's still the greatest.
I bet if you have a chance, go out, subscribe to our podcast, our YouTube channel. We'd appreciate that. Leave a comment. I'm getting choked up, but anyway.
This means a lot to Lee.
It
about
does.
to start. Okay.
It does.
All right. Well, appreciate you guys watching, and we'll see you next week on Election Tuesday.
Have a great week.
The hosts of the Market Moment podcast are employees of Mach 1 Financial Group, LLC. Mach 1 is a registered investment advisor located in Rogers, Arkansas. Mach 1 may only transact business in those states in which the firm maintains a notice filing or has qualified for an exemption or exclusion from registration. A copy of Mach 1's current written disclosure brochure is available through the SEC website and available at disclosures.mach1fg.com. Thank you for listening to the Market Moment podcast.